Shalom and welcome to Nail or Glide Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our series in the book of Genesis, and we'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 13, which I've titled When Men Moved Tents. Now, what is the context of Genesis 13? In order to understand the context of Genesis 13, we need to do a review of the previous chapter in Genesis 12, where God called Avram to leave his land, his father's house, and the place of his birth, and go to the land that the Lord would show him. Now we know that Avram obeyed this command of God. He went down, left Haran, went down to the land of Canaan, and then because of a famine in the land, he ended up going down to Egypt, going a little bit too far down south, got in a situation there, calling his wife Sarai his sister, and Pharaoh takes her, and that whole situation. And at the end of Genesis chapter 12, after the Lord had struck Pharaoh in his house, we see how Pharaoh asked Avram to leave and commanded his servants, Pharaoh commanded his servants to make sure that Avram left with all that belonged to him. So that brings us up to where we're at in Genesis chapter 13. And now we see how Avram leaves Egypt and goes back to the land of Canaan. That's where we begin in Genesis chapter 13, verse 1, where we read, "And Avram went up from Egypt, him, his wife, and all that was his, and Lot with him to the Negev." Now, in the previous teaching, someone in the online class asked a great question that I wanted to share with you all here. And this man asked, "Did Avram go against the will of God by going down to Egypt?" And it's a very good question that I thought about myself, but we don't have a direct answer to this because we don't see that the Lord spoke specifically about not going to Egypt. However, I do believe that the language that we read about in Genesis chapters 12 and 13 does help us to understand kind of the behind the scenes, what was going on there. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So just answering this question, did Avram go against the will of God by going down to Egypt? Now in Genesis 12:10, it says this, "And Avram went down to Egypt," right? And in Hebrew, this is Vayered Avram Mitzrayma, and Avram went down to Egypt. And then in Genesis 13:1, the verse I just read, we read, "And Avram went up from Egypt." And in Hebrew, Vaya'al Avram Mi Mitzrayim, and Avram went up from Egypt. Now these are simple phrases, but there are times in the scriptures when the wording of to go down and to go up are used to convey both a physical and a spiritual message. And I believe that's what we're seeing here. I just want to share a few examples in other places where we see that kind of overlap of the physical and the spiritual. Now there's a section in the book of Psalms, chapters 120 and 134, where each of the Psalms, it begins with this phrase, Shir HaMa'alot, which means a song of ascents, right? So all of these Psalms 120 and 134, are part of these songs of ascent, right? And now these Psalms are songs that were sung by the people of Israel when ascending to the temple in Jerusalem to worship God. And the place of Jerusalem is a mountain surrounded by mountains, right? The city of Jerusalem is a few mountains, right? But the Mount Zion, right, the one mountain where the temple was, that was a mountain that's surrounded by mountains. And one always speaks of going up to Jerusalem physically, but it's also a spiritual ascent of meeting the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. So there's that physical and spiritual aspect to going up to Jerusalem. We see another example of this in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, which is a prophecy regarding the end days when it says, "And many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Right? We've all heard this before. But again, it's that idea of physically going up as well as spiritually going up to worship the Lord and to receive teaching. Now, although Jerusalem is not surrounded by the highest mountains in Israel, one always speaks of going up to Jerusalem because of its spiritual significance. This is not a new concept, right? We've heard this before. Now, another example of how the physical and spiritual meaning of going up and going down is seen in the Bible is found in the life of Jonah. Just want to read the first 3 verses in Jonah chapter 1, where it reads, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. That's Jonah 1, 1-3. Now the Lord called Jonah to rise up and go to the people of the city of Nineveh. Jonah rose up, but he fled from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, or Yaffo, as we say it. He went down into the ship and ran from the call of the Lord. So even in this this description of the account that happened in Jonah's life, we can see how it's both a physical going down as well as spiritually running away from the Lord. Now, although Avram's going down to Egypt was not an act of running from God, it appears that it was a step in the wrong direction, right? That going down to Egypt, and then when he comes back, right, he's going up to, he comes up from Egypt or up to the land, right, of the land of Canaan. Now, in the next few verses in Genesis chapter 13, we read how Avram returned to the place of Beit El, right, to the mountain in the city of Beit El, the house of God, right? That's how it's translated. So let's read Genesis 13, 2-4. "And Avram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold, and went on his journey from the Negev and continued to Beit El, to the place where his tent was in the beginning, in between Beit El and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there in the beginning. And there Avram called upon the name of the Lord." Now, outside of the silver and gold, right? We read how not only how the Lord promised to bless him, but how the Lord literally made him rich, right? We read this in Genesis 13, too. Avram was rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold, in all these different ways. Now, Avram was blessed from the beginning of his days in the land until the end of his days. We see that consistently in the scriptures. Avram returned to the location where he formerly dwelt in the land of Canaan, on the mountain of Beit El, which is explained as being between Beit El and Ai, right? So probably one of the mountains in Beit El, in that region there, kind of as you see it in the center of your screen. Now the city name Ai in Hebrew is Ha'ai, and it's spelled with the Hebrew letter He in front of it. And although it is understood at the same time that the city name is simply the Ain and the Yud without the He in front of it. However, it's always spelled with the He in front of it. And just to point out that in Hebrew, the He at the beginning of a word is used for specificity, or like the certain city, right? Or it's simply used as a way of honoring the name of a person or a place. And so however it's used here, we always see the He in front of the city name, Ha'ai. Now, all the details in Genesis chapter 13, verses 1-4 remind us of the promises that God made to Avram when he first called him back in Genesis 12, 1-3. The Lord called Avram to the land of the Canaanites. He promised to bless him, and he promised to be a source of protection around him by blessing those who bless him and cursing those who curse him. Avram spent time in the land of Egypt, and he got himself in a compromising situation there with his wife and Pharaoh. But then Avram returned to his calling, right? We read how, number 1, Avram went up from Egypt. Number 2, he returned to the land of Canaan. Number 3, he returned to Beit El, the house of God. Number 4, he returned to the altar that he had built to the Lord. And number 5, he called upon the name of the Lord. And just to mention, in Genesis 13, it may be referring back to when he called upon the name of the Lord before at Beit El, or that he did it again, or both, that he did it before and he did it again. Either way, it's interesting to see how Avram called upon the name of the Lord. It's interesting to see when the Lord responds to him, or when the Lord speaks to him again at Beit El. And we'll see that in a minute. Now, Avram's return to Beit El appears to also be a return to his spiritual calling. And let's continue in Genesis 13 to see how this fits together. So verses 5-9. "And also Lot, who went with Avram, had flocks and oxen and tents, but the land was not able to sustain them together, for their possessions were great, and they were not able to dwell together. And there was strife between the shepherds of Avram's livestock and the shepherds of the livestock of Lot. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were still dwelling in the land. And Avram said to Lot, "Let there not be strife between me and between you, or between my shepherds and your shepherds, for we are brothers. Is not all the land before you? Please separate yourself from me. If to the left, I will go to the right, or if to the right, I will go to the left." So again, that's Genesis 13, verses 5 to 9. Now we learn in these verses that Lot was also wealthy, right? In verse 5 it says, "And also Lot, who went with Avram, had flocks and oxen and tents." And just to emphasize how possessing large numbers of flocks, herds, and cattle was a source of great wealth in biblical times. We read in Proverbs chapter 27 about the financial stability of owning livestock, right? Flocks and herds. So we can read Proverbs 27, 23 to 27, where we read, "Know well the condition of your flocks and pay attention to your herds. For riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. When the grass disappears, the new growth is seen, and the herds of the mountains and the herbs of the mountains are gathered in. The lambs will be for your clothing, and the goats will bring the price of a field, and there will be goat's milk enough for your food, for the food of your household, and sustenance for your maidens." Proverbs chapter 27 is beautifully illustrated here, how a person who owns flocks and herds has the means of providing clothing and food for one's own household. You can also use livestock for buying and selling property, right? There is another source of wealth, and that's what we clearly read in these verses. Possessing large numbers of livestock was a sign of great wealth in antiquity. Lot was wealthy with great flocks, just as Avram was wealthy at that time. Also, however, it does mention that Avram had silver and gold. It doesn't attribute silver and gold to Lot, and maybe that goes to show the extra blessing that God had bestowed upon Avram. Right now, it was most likely because of Lot's connection to Avram that he had become rich with livestock. The Lord promised to bless those who bless Avram, and Lot benefited from this promise, right? Because he was a relative of Avram. More than likely, he was in good relationship, and he was blessing Avram, so he was blessed himself. Now, why does Lot's financial portfolio also include tents, right? Just to see that again in Genesis 13:5, and also Lot, who went with Avram, had flocks and oxen and tents. So why does it include tents? Now we know in order to maintain a large number of livestock, there must be a workforce to care for and shepherd the livestock. Just like Avram, Lot had servants and shepherds. The mentioning of tents in this context seems to be referring to the servants who stayed with Lot and tended to his livestock, as well as to the other day-to-day chores, right? All the different tasks that need to be done. Before the modern times, you need lots of hands to do all of the the cooking, the cleaning, all the things that we do daily. Now the combined wealth of Avram and Lot was so great that there arose disputes between their shepherds, between their servants, right? Again, to read verses 6 to 7 again, "But the land was not able to sustain them together, for their possessions were great, and they were not able to dwell together. And there was strife between the shepherds of Avram's livestock and the shepherds of the livestock of Lot. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were still dwelling in the land." And we know that resources need to be continually sought out for livestock to have plenty to eat and drink. Disputes and strife arose between Avram's shepherds and the shepherds of Lot regarding the providing for the livestock. The land can only provide so much vegetation and water in order to sustain a certain number of cattle and herds. It was no longer feasible for them to remain together because of their great wealth. Now, we also read an interesting side note in verse 7 where it says, "Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were still dwelling in the land." This information about the Canaanite in the land is repeated in the story of Avram, and I just mentioned there Genesis 12:6. So why does the biblical text add this little note of information regarding the people dwelling in the land, the Canaanite and the Perizzite? Now, there are more than likely several different reasons for this. One reason is to state the obvious. The Canaanite and the Perizzite were still dwelling in the land when Avram entered it. The land of Canaan was promised to Avram by the Lord, and and to Avram and his descendants, but the Canaanites remained in the land for some time. And just to reiterate that we know that it wasn't for another 400 years that the Canaanite was kicked out or destroyed, right? When the Israelites came into the promised land after they came out of Egypt. So the Canaanite remained in the land for another 400 years. Now, another reason for why the inhabitants of the land are mentioned in this context in Genesis chapter 13 may be to explain an additional reason for why Avram asked Lot to separate from him. If Avram and Lot had so much cattle and livestock that the land was not able to sustain them, they could have presented a threat to the people in the land. And they could have thought that they were becoming so rich that they would take over all the land, right? So Avram probably did not want to draw attention to himself from the inhabitants of the land. Therefore, as the elder and responsible one among them, Avram made a decision and offered a solution. Again, as we read in verses 8 to 9, and Avram said to Lot, "Let there not be strife between me and between you, or between my shepherds and your shepherds, for we are brothers. Is not all the land before you? Please separate yourself from me. If to the left, I will go to the right, or if to the right, I will go to the left." So that's verses 8 and 9. So we read here how Avram spoke to Lot in a very direct but polite manner. While reminding Lot that they are relatives, he uses the term brothers here, right? But spoken as family. Avram told Lot that he did not want any strife between them or between their shepherds. Avram then requested that Lot separate from him, right? And he said, quote, "Please separate yourself from me." Avram told Lot to go wherever he wanted, but he needed to separate himself from Avram. And just to point out here that the English is a good translation from the Hebrew, which simply says, "Hipared na me'alai," right? Please separate from me. It's a very direct statement. There was a clear command from Avram to Lot. Please separate yourself from me. Avram could have suggested to Lot that he go to a certain territory and that Avram would remain in a certain territory, but he did not. Avram commanded Lot to separate himself from him. I believe that Avram realized that Lot should have never come with him when they left Haran. Just a reminder of what God said to Avram in Genesis 12:1, "Go away from your land and from the place of your birth and from the house of your father to the land that I will show you." Avram brought part of his father's house with him, his nephew Lot. Avram commanded Lot in a respectful manner to separate himself from him, and Lot did so. Avram corrected a mistake he formerly ignored or that he let occur. We don't know exactly what happened there. Now, Lot had no part in the calling and blessing of Avram. Lot obeyed and separated himself from Avram, as you read in the next few verses. Let's continue in Genesis 13, beginning in verse 10 up until verse 13. "And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, for it was all well watered before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. And Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and he journeyed to the east, and they separated each man from his brother. Avram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the valley, and moved his tent toward Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord." So that's Genesis 13, 10 to 13. Now the separation of Lot from Avram was a significant milestone in the life of Avram, as we'll see more. Now we read how Lot lifted his eyes and looked down upon the lush green area of the Jordan Valley. The description of the Jordan Valley before God destroyed it was likened to the garden of the Lord, right? Likened to the Garden of Eden, a well-watered area that was full of vegetation. The mentioning of Zoar is significant because this is the city that Lot fled to later on when the angels brought him out of Sodom when God destroyed it, as we read in Genesis 19, right? So this is interesting how it mentions this city here, which is in this Jordan Valley area. We don't know exactly where it is, but as you see it on your screen, kind of in the bottom center, it appears to be in the area of the southern end of the Dead Sea as we know it today. Avram and Lot were in the mountainous area of Beit El and Ai when they had this conversation, and Avram asked Lot to separate himself from him. And just to see it positionally, right? So you see Beit El or Bethel, as you read it in English, next to Ai there, kind of in the center right-hand side of the screen, which is right on the border, close to the Jordan Valley as it goes down there to the east. Now, Beit El sits at an elevation of about 860 meters above sea level, which is about 2,800 feet above sea level. And the Jordan Valley sits at a depressed elevation of about 390 meters below sea level, which is about 1,280 feet below sea level. So Lot had a good view from the high mountains above in the Beit El area to the Jordan Valley below, and he liked what he saw in the valley. Just to mention too that the very name Jordan in Hebrew is Yarden, coming from the Hebrew root word yarad, meaning to descend or go down, even as we talked about earlier in this teaching. Lot chose to go down because he liked what he saw. Lot's descent was both physical and spiritual in nature. And we see this in his not only his physical act, right, but also drawing close to the city of Sodom. The separation of Lot from Avram was a separation of the valley people from the mountain people. Read in verse 12, quote, Avram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the valley and pitched his tent toward Sodom. End quote. Avram dwelt in the high area in the mountains of the land of Canaan, where the Lord had guided him. Lot separated himself from Avram and went down to the cities of the valley of the Jordan and set up his tent toward Sodom. Lot could have chose to stay anywhere in the land of Canaan, but he chose to go down to the deep Jordan Valley and moved his tent toward the evil city of Sodom. We all know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, or as it's pronounced in English, Gomorrah. But in case we need a reminder, we read a brief summary of the situation in the city of Sodom in verse 13, Genesis 13:13, quote, now the people of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord, unquote, right? It's very clear that this was an evil place, people who committed wickedness, right? So Lot separated himself from Avram, the person on earth whom God had blessed, and he chose to draw near to the people of Sodom, the great sinners against the Lord. Lot's choice to move his tent toward Sodom would prove to bring judgment and moral degradation against him and his family. Let me just read that again. Lot's choice to move his tent toward Sodom would prove to bring judgment and moral degradation against his family, against him and his family. I'm going to read one more time. Lot's choice to move his tent toward Sodom would prove to bring judgment and moral degradation against him and his family. And it's interesting how he literally chose, right, to move his tent toward that evil city of Sodom. Now we continue to read the story of Avram in the final verses of Genesis 13. Let's read verses 14 to 18. And the Lord said to Avram, after Lot separated from him, lift up your eyes and see from the place which you are at, north and south and east and west. For all the land that you see, I give it to you and to your seed forever. And I will make your seed like the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, your seed also could be numbered. Rise up and walk about in the land, its length and its breadth, for I give it to you. Then Avram moved his tent and went and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So that brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 13. Now we're reading these verses how the Lord spoke to Avram for a second time in the land of Canaan. The first time that the Lord spoke to Avram in the land of Canaan was shortly after he first arrived at Shechem, as we read in Genesis 12:7. From Shechem, Avram journeyed south to Beit El. Avram built an altar at Beit El, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, as we read in Genesis 12:8. Then we know that Avram went down to Egypt, had the situation with Pharaoh. He left Egypt, went back up to the Negev. He entered and returned to the land of Canaan and arrived back to Beit El, where he had built the altar to the Lord. Now in Beit El, the Lord spoke to Avram for a second time. We don't know how much time passed, right, between the first time he was there and the second time. More than likely at least weeks, if not months, possibly even a year. We don't know exactly how much time passed. But now we read in Genesis 13:14, the Lord said to Avram, after Lot separated from him, right? So the second time of being in Beit El, after Lot separated from him. And I don't believe it was coincidence that the Lord spoke to Avram after Lot separated from him. It seems that verse 14 is communicating that the Lord spoke to Avram as a result of Lot's separation from him. This is the first time, or the second time the Lord's speaking to him, right? But the first time the Lord's speaking to him since that first time in Shechem, months earlier. The Lord had told Avram to leave his father's house. Lot was the one remaining family member whom Avram had to leave behind or send away. After Lot separated himself from Avram, the Lord spoke to him and further explained his promises to Avram. Just to read verses 14 and 15 again, where the Lord said to Avram, lift up your eyes and see from the place which you are at, north and south and east and west, for all the land that you see, I give it to you and to your seed forever. It's a powerful promise. Beit El is near the center of the land of Canaan. The Lord instructed Avram to look in every direction, and he promised that the whole land was given to him and to his seed forever. When the Lord first spoke to Avram in the land of Canaan, he promised that he would give that land to Avram's seed in Genesis 12:7. Now the Lord said to Avram, quote, I give it to you and to your seed forever. This guarantee of the land of Canaan to be given to Avram and his seed forever is a promise that is often repeated in the scriptures, as I listed here in Genesis 12:7, Genesis 15:18-19, and then Genesis 17, verse 8, and there's others as well. Now, it is this everlasting promise of the land that has brought the Jewish people back to the promised land after almost 2,000 years of exile to reestablish the modern state of Israel, right? So the very reason that Jews are back in the land today is because of this promise given to Avram 4,000 years ago. Now, I just want to jump ahead a little bit to what we read about the promised land in the law in the book of Leviticus. So at the giving of the law, the Lord specified that he is actually the owner of the land and that the people of Israel are sojourners or residents with him. So to read Leviticus 25:23, where it says, the land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are but aliens and sojourners with me. Now, the land of Canaan was given to Avram and his seed, the people of Israel, forever. When the Lord brought the Israelites into the promised land, he made it clear the land that he was giving to them is his land, right? It belongs to the Lord. Now, the context of Leviticus chapter 25 is the giving of laws for the land in order to prevent injustice from spreading in the land. And that is by selling and buying the land, right? And robbing people of their inheritance. So the Lord wanted to make sure that people feared him and understood that he is the true owner of the land. So the Lord provided for the right of redemption of the land so that poor citizens would be able to regain or redeem, right, possession of their land. So that's the context of Leviticus 25 when the Lord says it's his land, right? So we need to remember it in that context. The land of Canaan was given to the descendants of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? But it is the Lord who is the rightful owner of it all. There is both a physical and spiritual reality to the land of Israel. And this is the reason that there is continual war in the Middle East and especially in the land of Israel. The foundation of this land goes back to the curse of Canaan in Genesis 9 and the blessing of Avram in Genesis 12 and continuing in chapter 13. If we fail to understand the curse and the blessing of this land, we will tend to think that the problems in the Middle East are just political. The constant struggle over who has a right to the land of Israel is not political. It is spiritual, and it is explained in the pages of the Bible. So this is such an important foundation as we read here in Genesis chapters 12 and 13 with God's promise to Avram regarding this land. The Lord promised to give the land of Canaan to Avram and to his seed or his descendants forever. And that's what we read in Genesis 13, verse 15. Now, the Lord also reiterated his promise to multiply the seed of Avram, as we read in verses 16 to 18, where he said, "And I will make your seed like the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, your seed also could be numbered. Rise up and walk about in the land, its length and its breadth, for I give it to you." Then Avram moved his tent and went and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now, the words of the Lord to Avram seem to be building on his previous promises. The Lord had already told Avram that he would make him into a great nation back in Genesis 12, 2 and 3. Now the Lord said that his seed will be like the dust of the earth, meaning uncountable. It was as if God was saying to Avram, "I will make you into such a great nation that no one will even be able to count how many descendants you will have." Now the Lord continually spoke of the zerah, the seed of Avram. So the Hebrew word is zerah. Now, ironically, the Lord spoke this promise of Avram's seed while he was still just one, not having any children. The Lord had previously only promised to give the land to Avram's seed in Genesis 12:7, but now the Lord promised to multiply his seed as the dust of the earth, and told Avram that he gave this land to him and to his seed in Genesis 13:15. The Lord encouraged Avram to walk about the land, right? North, south, east, west. And he repeated that he is giving him this land. So he repeated the same promise of giving this land to Avram again in verse 17. Now Avram obeyed the word of the Lord as we read in verse 18. Then Avram moved his tent and went and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Again, that brings us to the end of this chapter. Now Avram went about the land of Canaan as God told him, and he moved his tent and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre in Hebron. This is a significant location, and it's the same place where the Lord would meet with Avram in a very special way, as we read about it in Genesis 18, and we'll focus more on that when we get there. But just to mention the significance of this place in the promised land, right? In the land of Canaan at that time. Now, we also read, then Avram moved his tent. And I just want to point out here the Hebrew verb in this phrase, which is vayehal. It's a very unique Hebrew verb. It's coming from this root word ahal, meaning to tent. Now, what we read in Genesis 13:18 is the unique form of this of the Hebrew noun ohel, meaning tent, right? And this word ohel is used throughout the Bible numerous times. But the verb form, meaning to move or to pitch a tent, is only used 3 times in all of the Bible. It's used twice here in Genesis 13, and then one other time in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 20. And just to mention the Isaiah 13:21, it's used in a general way in this prophecy regarding Babylon. So we're going to focus on the only 2 other times here in Genesis 13 because it's used in a significant way. The 2 times it's used in Genesis 13, it is used to contrast where Lot moved his tent and where Avram moved his tent. Lot dwelt in the cities of the valley and moved his tent toward the city of Sodom. Avram moved his tent to Hebron in the promised land in obedience to the word of the Lord. Very contrasting moves of the tents, right? The very acts of Lot and Avram and where they chose to live and move their tents were spiritual acts that displayed their faith. Lot dwelt in the evil cities of this world and moved his tent close to the wicked sinners living in Sodom. Avram moved his tent in the promised land. He walked by faith, and as we read in the New Testament, Avram was looking for the city of God. As we read in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 to 10, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. It's Hebrews 11, 8 to 10. The physical journey that Avram set out on with God caused him to continually make decisions. He needed to continually choose to walk by faith and obey the voice of God rather than listen to the voices in this world. In a similar way, we need to continually read the Word of God, listen for His voice, and choose to obey the voice of God over the voices in this world. I want to read 1 John 2:15 to 17 as a practical reminder of what we're reading in Genesis 13 with the contrast between how Lot chose where to move his tent and where Avram moved his tent, regarding the struggle of the lust of the eyes and listening to the voices in this world or listening to the voice of God, right? So 1 John 2:15 to 17. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts. But the one who does the will of God lives forever. 1 John 2:15 to 17. The actions of Avram and Lot are reminders of the daily choices in life that every one of us faces. Lot dwelt in the cities of the valley and moved his tent towards Sodom, as we read in Genesis 13:12. Avram moved his tent and went and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord, as we read in the last verse of Genesis 13. We need to listen carefully to what God is saying, obey His word, and walk in faith with Him. Let us take this lesson from how Avram and Lot moved their tents in different directions, and let us choose to listen to the voice of God. This is the conclusion to Genesis chapter 13, when men moved tents. Here are some of the resources I used in my preparation for this teaching. As always, feel free to share this teaching with others. I also want to invite you to partner with Ner L'Orglai. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're totally dependent on donations from viewers like yourself. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly emails to receive our teachings if you're not already receiving them. And you can do all this on our website, nerlorglai.com, or Psalm119.105.org. They are the same website. And so you can either go to the website or simply scan the QR code on your screen. It will take you to the website, and simply click the give or subscribe tabs as needed. Thank you so much. God bless you, and see you again next time.